From Photonics Media, this is All Things Photonics, a podcast shedding light on industry-shaping advancements in lasers, optics, imaging, metrology, and sensing. Each episode, our hosts speak with luminaries, rising stars, and market leaders about the trends shaping the current and future landscape of photonics. From space and deep-sea exploration to precision timekeeping and advanced manufacturing, this is the podcast for progress on All Things Photonics. This season of All Things Photonics is brought to you by Polyscience and Thor Labs.
Today's episode is brought to you by Polyscience. For over 60 years, the Polyscience line of award-winning temperature control equipment has been helping the photonics industry reach its goals safely and efficiently. Our products are made in America and delivered globally. Please visit polyscience.com to learn how we can help you. Changing the world of chillers is more than a tagline. It's a part of our history. Today's episode is also brought to you by Thor Labs. Thor Labs believes in the positive impact of photonics and hopes today's discussion inspires you. We're a vertically integrated photonics designer and manufacturer dedicated to making your ideas successful. To join our team or to learn more about our stocked offering or custom solutions, visit thorlabs.com.
In this episode of All Things Photonics, we'll begin by speaking with Javier Elizalde, Chief Operating Officer at Wooptix. Founded in 2016, Wooptix is the developer of Wavefront phase imaging technology, a versatile platform with applications in biological imaging, optics and lens testing, and semiconductor metrology. Following our conversation with Javier, we'll hear an on-site interview conducted by Antonio Castelo, Technology Manager at the European Photonics Industry Consortium, or EPIC, with Tim Kunze, CEO of Fusion Bionic, a startup specialized in the creation of advanced surface features via laser patterning. And to close out the episode, we have an interview with Kathleen Richardson of the University of Central Florida's College of Optics and Photonics, or UCF CREOL as it's colloquially known. As the leader of UCF CREOL's glass processing and characterization laboratory, Richardson is spearheading research into next-generation materials for use in optical applications like infrared systems. Our conversation focuses on chalcogenide glass, its importance, and some recent work developing a self-healing chalcogenide glass. Without further ado, here's Senior Editor Joe Kuczynski in conversation with Javier Elizalde of Wooptix.
I'm Joe Kuczynski, speaking with Javier Elizalde, founder and COO of Wooptix. Javier, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Joseph. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, let me start by discussing a little bit about Wooptix technology platform. As I understand it, Wavefront phase imaging has roots in adaptive optics for astronomy. Could you tell us about this technology heritage and how this platform works?
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for the interview, Joseph. It's a pleasure, as I said before. And yes, your information is totally accurate. Wavefront phase imaging, this is what we call our wavefront sensing technique, as you mentioned. It comes from adaptive optics from astronomy. So our technique was developed in the early 2000s by the Wooptix CEO and founder when looking to the stars from a telescope. To explain that a little bit, when a star is far away, it's not possible to see it because of the atmosphere. We can imagine the atmosphere as a layer of turbulence that makes it not easy to see the stars when the star is quite far away. So sometimes you see the star that is blinking, and other times you see just blur over there or like simulation of smoke. So one thing you do today is you use a deformable mirror that varies in just a few milliseconds. Just a note here, the turbulence varies at 10 milliseconds, so the deformable mirror needs to be quite quick, and the processing time needs to be really quick to be able to see the star in real time. We know it's light years, but when the light comes into the atmosphere, it's in real time. So actually using this deformable mirror came our initial discovery that instead of get rid of the turbulence in order to analyze the light that comes through the turbulence, we saw a spot over there that we could focus on the turbulence. Instead of getting in the sensor, we just focus on the turbulence. And from there, we just taking two planes in the turbulence, we were able to detect how the light is being modified in the turbulence. So that is when our technology was born, that we were capturing the wavefront phase on the turbulence.
Wow. Okay. And there seems to be kind of an interesting contrast in scale between the roots in adaptive optics and the technology's potential applications. With adaptive optics, of course, we picture these enormous observatories who are imaging at literally an astronomical scale. But with this new technology, we're looking at things that are incredibly small too. Tell us about some of those applications and what makes wavefront phase imaging well suited for these tasks compared to other traditional methods.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. Actually, we get that a lot. Because coming from astronomy, we are very used to get, as you mentioned, in very big and large samples. So first of all, we didn't try to get into the industry or any use case just to stay in astronomy. But when we reversed the engineer, so instead of going into a telescope, we tried it into a microscope. We found out that some of the optics that we custom are depending on the use case. So depending on the use case, we can do from shorter field of view that could be a microscope to larger field of view that could be some of the products that we have on semiconductor. So we found out that these use cases are easier to manage than looking at the stars, because with the stars, you cannot control the environment. You cannot control the clouds. You cannot control the turbulence that is very far away. You cannot control even the temperature between the telescope and the atmosphere. But in a lab, we are able to control all these environments. We control vibrations, we control temperature, we control sound, we control illumination. So actually, our WFPI technique, this is what we call the wavefront phase imaging technique. So the WFPI technique works perfectly in refraction and in transmission. This is something that we discovered as well. Transmission means transparent materials. The atmosphere, we consider that transparent. And we found out in the lab that we can work as well on reflection. That means that reflective objects, that for example, a mirror would be an example of that. Or in our case, a silicon wafer, is just like a mirror. So it was like a try and error. We did it several times. We tried with different use cases, trying to minimize the telescope into a microscope. And just in the path that we were going through, we found out that there could be some applications. And the different part right now is to target each of the application individually, because in the end, we need a custom optical setup for application.
Right, and that gives you the freedom and control in those situations to take care of those variables.
Yeah, totally, yeah.
And one of the things that makes startups so interesting, just beyond the new and exciting technologies, is the road to kind of commercialization and scalability, which can be a long one. Where is Wooptix in that journey?
Well, yeah, actually, I got this question a lot from investors right now. Right now, we are in a scale-up phase. You have to take into account that our company is focused right now into business units. One regarding a general compact wavefront sensor, that is an industrial camera. And the other one is very focused on semiconductor equipment. So scientifically, we've been demonstrating over the past 8 years that our technique, is valid for those two fields, I would say industry fields. The concept about a kind of company that we are right now is that we were born from deep tech. So we are a deep tech company. That means that it takes too long to get into industrialization and production. So we've been 8 years developing R&D, and now we are trying to restructure the company from R&D into production. The pros that we have right now at a startup that we are in this scale up is that we are back covered by our science IP. So we have developed a lot of knowledge during this year, and this is what is making us to be a little bit differentiable from the other things in the industry. So right now we are industrializing these two product lines, these two products. On one hand, we've launched as I mentioned before, the wavefront sensor as a camera format. That would be a very versatile product for any optical physics lab. And we are also that I think this is the biggest milestone we are achieving right now. Our first fab-ready semiconductor equipment. This last one is quite a pain because standardization barriers inside the chip fab are quite hard to meet. I think it's not, if not the most, is one of the most difficult industries to get in. So there are a few players in the industry, and it's totally scientific and cash-driven. And that for a startup or European startup is a huge pain because of finding funding is not that simple.
Right, understandable. And you mentioned wavefront sensing. Staying on that, wavefront sensing as a methodology envelops several distinct system architectures. The principal two being Shack-Hartman wavefront sensing and the other lateral shearing interferometry. As a methodology, what does wavefront sensing accomplish on a fundamental level, and how do variations to this type of sensing differentiate from one another?
Yeah. Sure. I think I'm going to go sideways. If your question first, I'm going to go about Harman and the shearing interferometry, and then talk a little bit about wavefront sensing and what's wavefront sensing. Because actually, when we talk about Harman or the interferometry in general, could be shearing, could be FISO, and our sensor, I think there are two different. One different in hardware and the other different in software. When I mean software, I mean algorithms. So in terms of hardware, both Harman and ourselves are a very simplistic hardware. Harman in one way, you have the sensor and you have the microlens on top, and that would be all that you need from a Harman. Of course, you can put on top a telecentric lens, something like that, depending on your optical arrangement. And in our case, it's just the same. You have a sensor, and then you have a tunable lens that is the particularity of our camera, for example. And in interferometry is quite more complex because you need several light rays and they need to be quite accurate when you want to test a sample. So one of the difference between Harman and interferometry or ourselves is that ourselves and Harman, we can do real-time acquisition with we can tolerate very good vibrations, sound vibrations, light vibrations, and temperature vibrations, while interferometry, you need to be very steady. The second part is that both Harman and ourselves, our processing algorithms are quite fast, while in the interferometry, you need to process more information. So in the end, computationally, we are quite cheaper. Our advantage here would be that in terms of resolution versus speed, we would be faster than Harman because, faster. We would be providing much more resolution because Harman in the end is the resolution is divided by the number of microlenses, so it's like a pain. And interferometry, for example, they have a good resolution as well. So I think both of three kind of systems or techniques are completely compatible depending on the use case per technique. And about wavefront sensing, in the end, you want to measure the wavefront. So what you are measuring is how the light is interfering through or to an object. I think this would be the most simplistic. I think it's better to see than to explain.
Right. My next question, can you describe, from Wooptix's point of view, the motivation and the process to adapting this quite established sensing methodology to something like semiconductor metrology, which obviously targets an industry sector that isn't quite so established?
Yeah. So, this is a very interesting question because in the beginning, we didn't found the company to be a semiconductor supplier. We founded the company to be a smartphone supplier. We thought that bringing our technology into the smartphones, it would enable you to get better pictures. But 8 years ago, something like that, it was an advice from some of the company members that we should go and follow semiconductor because scientifically, we would prepare for that. So after 1 year, some or less, studying the case, we discovered that it would be very interesting. And I would say that product market-wise is quite interesting. Actually, the margins over there and the possibilities for you to defend your technology is very high, not as in the smartphone market that is very mass consumer. So we are talking about an industry that every single product is the ground truth on its field. So you find all kind of equipment from 1 million euros to 400 million euros that all of the products that are inside of it are the ground truth. So I don't know if there's another industry like that. We could think about the space technologies, but most of them are old. So they need to be robust, but are old. So for us, being in this industry is a big challenge. First, because wavefront sensing is not used inside a chip fab. We are trying to, how do you say in English? We're trying to teach the industry that the wavefront sensing can have a spot inside semiconductor manufacturing.
Right. And tell me, hearing that, the initial focus was going to be towards cell phones and then there's this shift. What is that process like when you think you're going to be geared in one direction and then find out, wait, we might have to pivot now to a new focus, to a new industry?
Yeah. So I think the terms would be a huge slap that we received. We tried that for 6 months. We were inside a project inside one of the big companies for to have our own algorithms inside a chip, inside a smartphone. So it was a huge project for us. So in the end, we needed to survive. We knew that we had in the backup a huge technology, but we didn't know the use case. What we did is that when we are a startup, we get a little bit paranoid about the IP that you have, the knowledge that you hold, that it could be stolen from another company. What we did at that point, as we didn't have any other route to escape, we did the opposite. So we started talking to advisors or industry key opinion leaders and sharing with them what's the capabilities of our technology. And actually, we got this real advice about, okay, if what you do in astronomy and what you do in microscopy is real, you better try this in semiconductors. So in the end, I would like to say that we had this idea since the beginning, but it was not. This is not the case. It was imposed to us. And in the end, it's fantastic because we've been surviving these years with a lot of investment because in the end, in deep tech, the revenues are not high until you have a product that is today. So we've been suffering for 6 to 8 years. And right now, I think we are in the correct path. We have a lot of IP and a huge team that is working a lot and is brilliant team. I think almost half of the company is PhD. So not me, of course, but I try to have some better people than myself in the team.
Gotcha. Well, that's a great pivot to be able to make to switch those industries. And it sounds like, like you're saying, it was the right move, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I think it was the right move in the end.
Okay. Now, the ability to analyze structures that might be invisible to intensity-only imaging is so important to biological sciences, where spotting subtle changes is just crucial. How are you seeing wavefront sensing assisting in this field?
Yeah, so actually, personally, I'm not an expert in this field, and we are quite new in terms of transparent objects or transparent biological objects. We've been doing a lot of glass glass metrology or IOLs, intraocular lenses metrology. So biology is a field that we don't control too much. We know wavefront sensing has been not that long time ago, but it's amazing when you see a sample, because in the end, what we see when we are using these biomedical samples, you have to insert some chemicals over there in order for you to see the sample. As you mentioned, it was intensity-based, and this is how we started with intensity-based. But now with wavefront sensing, not just our technique, but I think the other techniques in the industry that they're using this wavefront sensing for microscopy is incredible how you can see three-dimensionally some samples live without applying any chemical. Because then the cell is behaving normal. It's not behaving different because it's been inserted by chemicals. So we made some research right now on neurons and blood, and the results are unbelievable. We are able to see neurons without chemicals, and as well as we see them transparently, we can recreate three-dimensionally the sample. On blood cells, for example, we can manage the X, Y, Z of the sample, so we are able to measure the blood cells. So I think that there's a very disruptive innovation in here, not just for ourselves, but in the end for all the way from the wavefront industry. That yes, it could disrupt a little bit what scientifics are seeing right now in biomedical samples.
And what is the feeling like when you see these disruptions, when, you try and you work on something, find a new application, say, wait a minute, this might change the standard of how people have been doing this, kind of this whole shift to a new way of thinking?
Yeah, well, first, you need very scientific people to work on that, to tell you that what you are doing is incredible. So now that we are growing the company, in the beginning, the company, as we were very few, we were like 10, 12 people. We were quite flexible. Right now that we are getting around 50 people, we have to do a lot of processes. So now when one of our researchers discovers something, we need to study, analyze, and so on. So at first, you think that they faked the sample. You say, okay, come on, yeah. The 3D you can do in, you say CGX, the special effects,
CGI.
All of that. Yes, in CGI, because what you see, of course, some of the things you're already seen in movies, but when you see the movies, you think that is totally possible here in the scientific industry, but it's not. So that's a very hard barrier that me, for example, that I'm not that technical, we need to cover that. But yeah, actually, we encourage a lot. We publish a lot of papers. We go to conferences as well, give oral talks, and we talk to the community of scientifics as well. So I think this is the most important part, being able to share that what you have discovered, and maybe you get some feedback that helps you out in the product. In the end, the goal is to provide a product for the scientifics to make their developments for their own.
Gotcha. Understood. So Wooptix has been sort of built around this wavefront sensor, born in 2016 and spawning its first patent. Now there's nearly a dozen families of patents for the company. So, obviously there's a growth and success there. So, my blanket question here is, what's next for Wooptix?
Yeah, so I want to make a point in here. So Wooptix was founded in 2016, but for us, that means that we got the first funding on 2016. The first discovery was from the Wooptix CEO, and it was in the early 2000s. That's when the WFPI, that means our technique, started. So from that and on, we've been optimizing and updating the technology up to 2016 when we got investment, and then we said, okay, now we have to do our manufactured product. So right now, what we would love for the company is for the scientists and other companies to try our products, because we really think that the way we capture wavefront phase is amazing, and they should try it out, because maybe they can find another product. So in the end, we don't want to make products for every industry. We don't want to make products for microscopy. We don't want to make it for analyzing the intraocular lenses, but we want to provide just a camera for them to try out these different products. So in the long term, we want to mature both our units and grow along the way with these users of our technology. This is what we are doing right now with semiconductors, for example. We are distributing our face camera on one way, and we are distributing as well our semiconductor equipment. So in the end, we want to continue making new product developments.
All right. Well, Javier, thank you so much again for your time and for sitting down for this discussion with me.
Well, thank you very much, Joseph. It's a pleasure.
Today's episode is brought to you by Avantes. Unlock the power of light with Avantes. For over 30 years, we've delivered precision fiber optic spectroscopy, trusted for custom integration and reliable data. Discover how to empower your application, industrial, scientific, or beyond. Visit Avantes.com and experience spectroscopy solutions that innovate. Today's episode is also brought to you by LightPath Technologies. From concept through prototyping, volume production, and global distribution, LightPath has the optical knowledge and manufacturing expertise to be your optics partner every step of the way. Visit lightpath.com to learn more.
During EPIC's meeting on laser microprocessing in Vilnius last month, Antonio Castelo was fortunate enough to be able to catch up with Tim Kunze, CEO of Fusion Bionic. The company's bio-inspired technology platform stems from years of joint research work between the Fraunhofer Institute for Material and Beam Technology and the Technical University of Dresden. Called direct laser interference patterning, the technique enables the creation of advanced surface features such as self-cleaning, anti-icing, antibacterial, and decorative properties, drag reduction, and more. That conversation is next.
We are here in Vilnius. We are attending the EPIC technology meeting on laser microprocessing. So Tim Kunze, CEO of the company Fusion Bionic, you were one of the speakers to talk about surface texturing and functionalization. It was really interesting. But I would like to explore a little bit more about your ideas, how this technology can be implemented in the industry. We can perhaps start with talking about your technology. What is unique about the proposal of Fusion Bionic?
Yeah, thanks, Antonio. So Fusion Bionic is a spin-off from the Fraunhofer organization in Germany, and we are a solution provider for functional surfaces using a unique technology called direct laser interference pattern. And what we are proposing is to alter and modify the functional performance of surfaces, but also to improve productivity of laser processes in general. So our technology is basically a multi-beam technology, very unique. We use interference mechanisms, let's say, to generate functional surfaces by micro nanotextures. And this has positive effect on cleaning properties of surfaces, bonding properties, and all related things which improve the surface performance in general.
As I mentioned, we had a specific session to talk about this texturing, and we hear applications in space, in automotive. You also presented in the solar panels. But which one do you think will be the most promising applications or markets for this technology?
Yeah. So they are basically, so we are exploring a lot of different kinds of applications in different industries. So let's say ranging from the semicon industry to the photovoltaics, but there are much more application cases across the medical, the automotive. I think basically what we are looking for and what we are exploring with customers is to improve the performance, and this, especially for new applications, new functionalities goes along with a lot of testing, of course, and a lot of course, development. Because some of these developments are, I would consider them groundbreaking, because you can substitute processes, you can maybe leave alone, let's say, or let away some of the process steps. So it's a huge benefit for our customers. But of course, it's sometimes can be some time for testing that and so on. And there are other applications where we substitute processes which are already existing and just improving productivity by having a, let's say, speed improvement several times partially. Not always, but we are working on that.
Okay. And of course, it takes time to introduce a new technology in the industry, and some of them are quite conservative in testing new technologies because they need to produce what they are doing. But what do you think they are the main challenges? Is because it's a new technology? Is because it's something that they never tested before, or they didn't know, and you need to explain the benefits behind that? Which ones do you think are the main challenges for moving this nice technology to the mass production in the industry?
Yeah. I think, of course, I mean, it's a laser technology, but even to laser experts, it's somewhat new. So because it was long-term considered as a nice tool and maybe a toy somehow, but people, I think, realize more and more that there are substantial benefits which can come through the technology.
Yeah.
And of course, I would say obstacles come from sometimes from the testing, which is connected to that, and other related things. So I think it's what people. So we are working on helping people to understand the potentials, helping to consider them in their production, and then work on together with them towards let's say to prove that this. So we have more than 70 customers in various industries, and let's say these processes are, let's say, on different levels, let's say. So some of them are early stage, some of the intermediate, and some of them we are close to some contract manufacturing and similar. It depends basically on the functionality and the surface, and also on the customer, of course.
Yeah. And regarding new developments, we hear a lot of different new laser sources appearing, higher powers. I guess these new developments benefits also the efficiency of the technology. Do you see that is something still missing, and how your technology got benefit from the appearance of new powers, new wavelengths, perhaps optical components?
Yeah. So what where we benefit a lot is from more powerful lasers. So interference technology lives from let's see, a certain amount of pulse energy, so it scales very nicely with pulse energy, with rep rate, so with the scanning system. So we started once with some fixed optics. It's quite slow, but then we advanced the technology towards scanning systems, Gaussian-based, polygon-based, and so it depends a lot on let's see, the scanning platform, but also the scanning strategy. And of course, we recognize more and more that sometimes, let's say, we also explore together with the laser suppliers, let's say, the benefits. I mean, for instance, there was recently deployment of the first 1 kilowatt laser in the industry on the industrial scale. So this shows that also the laser suppliers recognizes the product applications coming, there are the technology coming for bringing this to the road, let's say. And they start to decide, okay, go for kilowatts, ultra pulse lasers, maybe 2 kilowatts and so on. So it will come, I'm pretty sure of that. But it needs, let's say, a continuous movement of all the involved, let's say, people in the value chain, let's say, need to show the application, and then along with that it comes the laser sources, and it's a partnership.
So this kind of collaboration with laser manufacturers is critical for Fusion Bionic.
Yes,
absolutely. Technology.
Absolutely.
Okay, very good. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure, and thank you for summarizing a little bit some of the ideas we discussed this week in videos.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Thank you.
Up next, senior editor Jake Saltzman speaks with Kathleen Richardson of UCF CREOL.
Dr. Richardson, I appreciate you being here. And I really hope for this episode to be a bit more than a Chalcogenide 101, but I think we need to start there just to give our listeners sort of a semblance of what we're talking about. So I want to ask you this very 101 spirited question. What are chalcogenides? How are they differentiated from other optical glasses? And I think the bigger question here is, what are they useful for?
Well, first of all, Jake and your team, thanks so much for having me. And I love doing these types of tutorials because even at the highest level, although all things infrared have become extremely interesting and sexy on the photonic science side in the last decade or so, one of the things that has been interesting for me, as I have worked in chalcogenide materials for 30 years, is that their awareness on who they are, what their makeup is, and how can you optimize them for whatever their application is. And I think that was reflected in some of your questions that you've drafted. I think it's really important to step back and say, how do these materials, and they can be glasses or crystals, but we work primarily in glasses, and we like the flexibility that this particular type of material offers, because just like oxide glasses, and think of window glasses or BK7 or other optical elements that you might choose materials from the Corning or O'Hara glass or shot glass charts that are made up of materials that are oxides, which contain oxygen. Chalcogenides are non-oxide. And if you think back to your old chemistry days and the far right side of the periodic table, where group 4, 5, 6, and 7 are, and as well as the group 8s that typically don't get, the halides, which don't typically get incorporated, but sometimes do in these materials. Chalcogens make up group 6, which is under oxygen. So all those ingredients, sulfur, selenium, tellurium, form typically the basic backbone of chalcogenides. But what's unique is they do not include oxygen. So they are often called non-oxide glasses. And what's special about them is they transmit in the infrared. And so depending on, we call it the flavor of the materials or the chemical composition of the materials or the mixture of atoms that go into the bulk glass composition, depending on the ratio of those ingredients, they can transmit from the orange and red part of the visible spectrum all the way out beyond 20, 30, 40 microns if need be. And what makes them unique is that they're they have a very broad glass forming region, which means you can put varying ratios of these elemental starting materials together and make unique not only optical properties, but thermomechanical and all those other properties that are important when you have to consider the physical properties needed for the optical component and where that component has to live near other materials, and whether it's a bulk component, a film component, or a fiber component. So you've got a lot of knobs available in the non-oxide glass space that allows you to be very flexible. So that kind of differentiates non-oxides from oxides.
I would request that our listeners listen to those last 3 minutes there with as much focus as they can give. It's a very good tutorial and a very helpful tutorial to sort of get our conversation going. And I think one of the interesting things, one of the nice things about our conversation today is that it's going to weave in and out of sort of R&D level considerations, but also some industry considerations. I want to ask, and we're talking about chalcogenides here and principally glasses. What are some of the applications? I know when you mention infrared, we're talking a lot about defense and some aerospace, but also things like phase change memory.
Yeah. And you bring up a really important point. So let me dial back to those of us that are old enough or young enough to remember that a lot of the initial applications for infrared materials were indeed solely defense. And the chalcogenides chalcogenide glasses were not widely used, primarily because most defense systems, if they needed a infrared material that had to perform around room temperature, that they would choose germanium. And a lot of the legacy military systems that were built for infrared that needed to, whether it was for tank sites, whether it was for night vision systems, some of the things that allowed our soldiers to own the night, as the Army said back in the 80s. A lot of the systems were heavily reliant solely on germanium materials. And then gradually some of the zinc sulfide, zinc selenide, and some of the other crystalline, polycrystalline materials, or gallium arsenide. But glass really didn't figure into it in a pronounced way until probably the last 2 decades or so, where people started to recognize that the compositional flexibility that I just mentioned would allow you to dial in, like we do with oxide glasses, materials with unique refractive index, with unique dispersion capabilities or Abbe numbers, unique DNDT performance capabilities, all which need to be considered if you want to make a compact optical system that can transmit, image, reflect, whatever it needs to do in the infrared. Glasses give you a lot more tailorability. Now, those crystalline materials are still used, but similarly, glasses are becoming more and more incorporated into these systems, but they kind of suffer from the chicken and the egg problem of you have to have a specification written that calls for a specific flavor of glass with specific attributes, just like you do in the visible. And there needs to be enough systems and application spaces to be able to pull those capabilities from the commercial manufacturers. So glass companies aren't going to develop new flavors of material if there's not a demand. And the demand is now coming as we go from largely defense-focused infrared systems to more broadly employed security, perimeter security simulation, a wide variety of applications where we want to monitor, we want to sense, we want to be able to respond to different stimulus, whether it's radiation, whether it's temperature. Think of thermal cameras. Those are not for defense solely. You want to be able to see through fog or bad weather. And these systems now will more largely employ still some of those polycrystalline materials, but more and more glasses, because that enables you to make the systems more compact, more lightweight, to keep up with the progression that has taken place in the infrared detector world, which has miniaturized and gotten lightweight much quicker than the optics that sit in front of them.
You don't become a leading figure, an expert on this topic or any topic overnight, and you're obviously quite familiar with this class of glass, which is a fun rhyme. But I'm curious what sort of consideration you're giving to the application as your career is advancing. Certainly, you know the capabilities of the glass, of the materials, but you're sort of driven by where you're working, the applications that you're working towards. Are you aware of some of the applications, or is there a fun element of discovery that's taken place over the last 10, 15, 20 years as you've sort of reached the point now where you're able to have these types of conversations?
Well, it's interesting that you phrase your question that way, because I went to the New York State College of Ceramics at Alfred University, and I worked at the University of Rochester's laser laboratory on phosphate laser glasses. I started my career, and I worked there for almost 7 years, went back to Alfred for my PhD, and clearly defined right at the beginning, I wanted to work in a flavor of glass that was different from most others. And I was fortunate enough to work with Professor Bill LaCourse on non-oxide glasses, and I saw the potential. There wasn't the commercial demand at the point, but I saw the potential of these tailorable materials to address a lot of questions and limitations that I knew conventional materials that were already on the market couldn't satisfy. And that response and that awareness has followed me through my 35 plus year career, where now key systems designers come to us and say, Kathleen, we need a glass that does this, 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 and this. This is available, but it doesn't do this. This is a commercial product, but it doesn't do that. Can you make a glass that will not only give me these things, but give me this, this, and this, that those are missing? And typically we say, well, physics is not forgiving. It has limitations, but let's take the things that you need and prioritize them as to what's most important for your application. Because if it's on a defense system that's flying, it has to have one set of criteria. If it's on a land-based system, or if it's on a satellite-based system where temperature excursions are very extreme, that ranking of priority of properties becomes different. So my career has really evolved with the community's awareness and education in the potential of these materials, and the fact that many times there are not enough commercially available flavors of material that can satisfy those things. So we are constantly challenged and well-funded to develop new materials that may not hit every single property in that list perfectly, but we typically get the top 3 or 5 fairly well pinned down. And in many cases, it's not necessarily a complete replacement for an existing material. It's an improvement over existing available materials that could help a system be more compact, be more lightweight, be more robust, live longer if there's perhaps radiation-induced effects that degrade the material's performance over time. So those are the challenges that we're typically faced with.
And these aren't these requests that you face from industry, some of these systems requirements. These aren't happening in a vacuum, right? There are things happening globally that are driving, advances and pivots. And I think about the export control measures with germanium and gallium too. But a year ago now, with Chinese exporters. I mean, has any of this, as your career has moved from one place to another, has any of this surprised you? Because we're at a point now where a conversation on chalcogenide glasses and materials is uber relevant.
Oh, it's super relevant. And, we've seen a lot of demand, and even 2 or 3 years ago, the push was, or up to 10 years ago, was for swap. So size, weight, and performance. Can you make an existing system smaller, lighter weight, and more agile? Well, that is something that glass played a great role in, because glass is a lot less heavy than germanium, for example. But you raise a really important point, and that is the limitation on raw material supply. I'm sure you and our viewers have heard a lot about rare earth limitations. Well, germanium and gallium are even in a more critical space, and it's primarily due to multinational alliances really working on gathering up and holding on to and restricting the supply to many of our commercial system builders that rely on germanium. And we have some domestic manufacturing in the U.S., and it's been a real wake-up call, not only to protect and maintain the level of germanium that we have in this country, but to also start to get very creative about how do we take some of that legacy material that is contained within the U.S. Defense Logistics Agency has a stockpile, and to be able to think about ways to protect that and reuse it and purify it and take it out of old legacy systems where it's not being used anymore, but refine it back so it's good enough optical quality to go into some of the current applications. So that's the germanium and, as you mentioned, gallium issue. But I will tell you that it has also driven us glass manufacturers, so not pure germanium users, to think of clever ways where we can reduce the amount of germanium in our glasses. Because if you look at the 6 or 7 commercially available flavors of glass that are on the market by U.S. manufacturers, and there are 4 glass manufacturers in the U.S. that sell chalcogenide materials, almost all the commercial materials have some amount of germanium in them. So I don't believe we will ever be germanium free, because germanium is one of those building blocks in the glass network that gives you some of the more enhanced robustness of physical and mechanical properties. A germanium-free material would have a little more loose structure and correspondingly higher thermal expansion, lower softening point, be a little bit less resilient in thermal excursions and things like that. So germanium plays an important role as a building block in that glass network. But we want to be clever about how we can either minimize its use, change the composition, or we are right now working on a project out of DoD through Americom, which is working in defense optics manufacturing, with the focus to examine how can we recycle or reuse germanium and germanium-containing glasses to feed them back into the glass processing cycle and understand how to do this efficiently while maintaining the key optical quality that the customers demand in terms of the homogeneity and other properties that people expect when they come and order glass for their optical design application.
I don't know if fun is the right word, but certainly interesting. An interesting thing to think about is, if you talk about theoreticals, and germanium really came into a difficult supply situation, at least in this country, what would it take logistically to change some of the DoD lens prints that have become quite accustomed to some of these legacy materials? I mean, do you care to speculate? I mean, what could that look like? Could that really be something that we face here as we move forward into 2025?
Well, we have, as you might expect, a wide variety of DoD partners and customers that we work closely with. And in addition to Americom, we have close ties to C5ISR, which is the old Army night vision lab at Fort Belvoir, where a lot of the key research on infrared materials over the years, whether it's detector materials or optics, this is something that their team is looking at very seriously, because, of course, many of the deployed systems care about all of the constituents, all of the optical materials that are incorporated into not only the Army systems, but all of the DoD agency systems. So it's something that I think we are aware of, because the primes are aware of, the Lockheeds, the Raytheons, the BAEs, the folks that have to build these systems and are now trying to get their hands on this materials. They are now starting to see some of these issues, and I think they're not going to go away anytime soon. So a lot of people are thinking about this, and a lot of people are trying to be very, very smart about how to approach this. And certainly our colleagues in the Army, who we have a lot of work with right now, this is front and center. So new materials, alternative materials that have added optical function, like for gradient index applications, where you might be able to, instead of having 2 components, maybe put 1 component with a grin on it to reduce the not only reduce the swap, but also to possibly think about reducing the need for a germanium silicon doublet, for example. So that is another way of possibly getting around the germanium content in an optical system. So people are thinking about it, and it's going to become more and more of an issue.
Yeah, one of the people who I'm certain is thinking about it is our friend Sam Rubin of LightPath, friend of the podcast, who I know is thinking about it because he's talked about it with us. And that's sort of a nice segue into this question. I mean, you're at UCF CREOL now, not physically now, but that is your home for research right now, and that is a dynamic environment, certainly in this country. But you haven't been there forever. What has that environment been like in the move, sort of from the higher ed setting, out of the higher ed setting, and then back again?
Yeah. So, well, I have been in academia pretty much since I left Alfred in the early 90s. And I was at CREOL for 13 years before I went to Clemson and led the material science and engineering school there for 8. And then I came back for the last 12 years to CREOL. And you are exactly right. Sam is a great friend and a colleague at LightPath, right a half mile away from my labs. And not only he in the Central Florida region, but not only the primes at Missile and Fire Control at Lockheed over on Sand Lake Road, but also I want to just give a shout out to Valencia College, where they've been spinning up the Photonics Technician program funded by Americom, along with many other sites within our country to address workforce training. So we're especially proud to be really one of the key go-to educational organizations in the country for people who master various aspects of infrared materials, whether it's glass in my group, transparent ceramics with Professor Romain Gomez, who's also at CREOL, or Professor Paraj Banerjee, who's in material science and engineering, who does ALD and other types of coatings of materials, and we've pulled him into the infrared. But our students go on to, and I'm extremely proud of the fact that of those 4 domestic glass manufacturers that I just mentioned, the leading glass scientists in these, and 3 of the 4 of those entities are graduates from our program. So, they are the leaders that are now coming out with some of this new thinking of how to engineer new materials. And we continue our longstanding relationship with these companies because not only are they products of our group, but they recognize the value of workforce training, hosting internships, exchanging students with them. So it is a dynamic environment, but it's one where you need just as much focus on the education and training of this workforce going forward, so that we can maintain the pipeline into not only defense, but a wide variety of applications where infrared glasses are finding use.
I want to ask you about some of your current work, or recent work anyway. You've done a lot of work with self-healing glasses over the years, and including recently. A particular discovery or published paper this year that falls into the category of self-healing. I suppose the first question I should ask is, what are we talking about when we talk about a self-healing glass?
Well, let me just highlight kind of the bare bones basics of that, because I've talked a lot about bulk optics when you think of lenses, whether they're spherical or aspherical. The work on self-healing glasses really came about with some of our longtime partners at MIT and the Microphotonics group. That's Kim Kimmerling, Anu Agrawal, and JJ Hugh. And the MIT team cold called me now 20 years ago and said, Kathleen, we want to make optical planar systems that are not just germanium and silicon. We want to dial in glass. And we've been working together ever since. And as part of a Department of Energy NA22 program, now almost a decade ago, our team worked hard, along with colleagues when I was then at Clemson, to evaluate all of the optical materials that might exist on a planar wafer, so a planar photonic chip. We published probably the first paper with Ben Eggleton back in 2011 on Chalcogenide photonics, and we put a envisioned cartoon of a chip that had all integrated photonics, including Chalcogenide waveguides and resonators, foam coatings, which were sensitive to chemical sensing environments, integrated detectors, as well as other types of optical elements on a chip, compatible, multi-material, compatible with on-chip CMOS manufacturing technology. And over those 10 years since, we have developed those and tested each of those individual components. So of all those components, detector materials, foam that was used for sensing chemical or chemical environments for biochem, noses essentially, as well as the chalcogenide waveguides and the sources and resonators. Our program aimed at saying, what is the weak link of all those flavors of materials that would coexist on a chip? Because if you put these out and expose them to radiation, regardless of what kind of radiation, we needed to know what was the weak link that would fail first. And so we did individual gamma radiation evaluation and assessment of reaction for each of these materials. So in semiconductors for detectors, polymers for these foams, chalcogenides for the resonators, as well as the silicon itself. And in addition to evaluating the response of each of the individual ingredients, we then built one of these chips and characterized the loss evolution that comes from the degradation of these materials upon exposure to radiation. And at the time, we were partnering with some colleagues at Aerospace Corporation out in Pasadena, who had done a lot of work on low Earth orbit evaluation of these materials. And we found it very interesting because gamma radiation in particular has some very unique degradation mechanisms depending on whether the material is a semiconductor, a polymer, or a glass. In the case of chalcogenide, and why we call it self-healing, it turns out that these big atoms, characteristic of those items in the far right side of the periodic table, when those big atoms bond together, they form very weak bonds. That's why these materials are much more lower temperature than oxide materials, for example. But one attribute of those weak bonds is that they can be physically distorted or broken by gamma radiation. But it turns out room temperature is enough to physically reorganize or heal those broken bonds. And that's what we mean by self-healing. So with our team, primarily led by Professor Myung-Koo Kang, now at Alfred University, Myung-Koo and I and the MIT team, along with Igor Luzanov at Clemson, really articulated who is the weak link of all these materials. Is that weakening permanent? Or in our case, is it recoverable? And under what conditions are they recoverable? And it turns out, just due to the bonding that's present in these chalcogenide glasses, even though the chalcogenide waveguides did degrade, it turned out that room temperature was sufficient energy, or KT, to cause those bonds to then rearrange and reform. And that's what we mean by self-healing.
There's a who's who of glass luminaries there in that answer, photonics industry change makers. Anyway, so here's another sort of hypothetical question. I mean, you're doing this work, and one discovery leads to another, and suddenly you have 10 years worth of research and development to pursue. Are you always thinking about applications in your work, or is some of this just fun?
Well, I'm going to say it's both. And I'll tell you, the challenge as an academic is, how do I take some of these very applied, very specific, think DoD needs, and how do I sanitize it and bring it down to the core fundamental question of physics or chemistry or material science that needs to be answered to lead to the solution for the application. So they're always interconnected, but as an educator, my students have to publish, they have to present in meetings, and they have to be able to really get to the nuts and bolts of the challenge of the question. And that's the fundamental science. Whether, I'm a professor of optics, but I have had faculty appointments in chemistry and material science, and it's a very multidisciplinary research activity, but you have to be able to distill it down so that the student can publish and therefore graduate. So there is a fundamental component to it, but it is the application that funds the research, which allows the student to get the degree in that area. So we have to do both. We have to make sure our sponsors get the technical evaluation that makes the most sense for their needs, but we also have to preserve the fundamentals that the students need to know so that they can demonstrate a body of work that comes out of their dissertation to allow them to grow as researchers.
As you talk about budding research stars or research professionals anyway, can't help but think about the discipline. And I want to end on this. What's next for the future of chalcogenides, and where is this going? I mean, you've been in this space now for 3+ decades. You've seen quite a bit of growth. You've seen companies and materials developed, and that is no small feat, but more to come, I suspect.
Well, we're excited because I am proud to say that I think and I say this we because there's a lot, I mention a lot of our partners who do things that I don't do in my lab, but we as a team are better because, and you mentioned our work in phase change materials, we could never do this if we didn't have thin film capabilities to really engineer and photolithographically produce some of these unique structures. And that's a testament to JJ and the team at MIT. But I say that because that's one example of many that I highlighted in a plenary talk I just gave last month in Korea at the International Commission on Glass, where I said we're really in a stage where we're redefining a paradigm of design of infrared systems and the optical materials that go in them. And what I mean by redefining the paradigm, what's the paradigm shift? Well, the paradigm shift is largely that historically we've been both based on homogeneous materials, chunks of BK7, chunks of germanium, chunks of infrared glass. Well, where we have been working for the past 10 years is really at the interface of how can I add functionality where I can do multiple things in the same material, whether it's by grading refractive index, whether it's by making a glass ceramic instead of a glass that has better thermomechanical robustness. So I optimize multiple materials attributes, not just optical. They, of course, have to have low loss and good transparency and good thermomechanical resistance over the environment of use. But how can I add some other function into the same component so I get more bang for the buck? And if you ask me where the future of chalcogenide-based materials are going, and that could be glass ceramic, transparent ceramics, or some combination thereof, where we put an amorphous coating on a transparent ceramics because it senses a certain attribute that our sensor has to be able to detect. The multifunctionality, and that is the new paradigm that we've certainly been thinking about in terms of how do we engineer materials to be more robust and more unique and more suitable to address some of the unique challenges that, whether it's environmental sensing for a variety of climate-related research, whether it's things that fly on drones that can sense and detect and see and measure, all of those things are really demanding that we have a lot of function in a little package. And we really believe with the power that infrared radiation and seeing in the infrared brings, that our materials are well suited to be able to have that flexibility that sometimes homogeneous materials just don't have.
Dr. Kathleen Richardson from the University of Central Florida, CREOL, joining us on the All Things Photonics podcast. Dr. Richardson, thank you for your time and your insights, and we'll talk again soon.
Great. Thanks, Jake.
With that, we conclude another episode of All Things Photonics. Thank you to our sponsors, to the technical staff behind the scenes, and to continued support from the Photonics Media editorial team. As always, questions, comments, thoughts, and ideas are welcome. Let us know how we're doing via email at allthings@photonics.com. All Things Photonics is available on all major platforms and on our website, photonics.com.